In the Allied headquarters at Reims, Colonel General Jodl signed the instrument of German surrender on May 7, 1945. At midnight of the next day, there ended in Europe a conflict that had been raging since September 1st, 1939.
General Jodl, Chief of Staff of the German Army, faced his conquerors across a narrow table in a French schoolroom, and thus ended the reign of the so-called master race. Official emissary of the defeated Nazi Empire, Jodl surrendered unconditionally to the victorious Allied powers, with the United States represented by Lieutenant General Walter Beadle Smith. In just a few minutes, the simple ceremony in the little schoolroom brought to an end the major phase of the most paralyzing war the world had ever known. A war which had involved millions of men, some of whom fought relentlessly for the domination of the world, and others to give mankind throughout the world the chance to live in freedom and at peace. The long-awaited victory was a reality. In its wake, the war left Germany in ruins, her principal cities and towns demolished, some 8 million of her people killed or wounded, and her industry almost obliterated. A nation completely broken in spirit and starving. For the Allies, the price of victory was appallingly high, beyond the powers of any statistician to compute. History lays the blame for this costly world struggle on the head of one man, the little German house painter who had instilled a hysterical devotion to his party and cause in millions of German men, women, and children. Adolf Hitler's pattern for conquest was based on promoting unrest and riots, and then forcing Nazi party members into key posts. In March 1938, such a bloodless revolution was conducted in Austria. The Nazis took over the government. German troops poured across the border. And once proud Austria became the first nation to fall before the weight of Nazi aggression. Ignoring worldwide protests, Hitler looked about for still other fields of conquest. At Munich in September 1938, he took full advantage of the willingness of more peaceable nations to compromise, to agree to almost any Hitler proposal that would avert war. Signed eagerly by Hitler, by Benito Mussolini for Italy, by Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain for Great Britain, and by Premier Edouard Daladier for France, the historic Munich Pact called for the Nazi occupation of the Sudetenland territories of Czechoslovakia. Protection was guaranteed for shrunken Czechoslovakia's new borders. But to Hitler's henchmen, the pact was merely a slip of paper. Only 6 months later, its terms were forgotten, and the Nazi tide swept without resistance over all Czechoslovakia. Into Berlin, heart of the Nazi homeland, Adolf Hitler was paraded as the greatest conquering hero of the ages. The heady fever of victory was sweeping across the whole of the Reich, drawing more and more Germans to the enthusiastic support of the Führer. After months of negotiations with Britain and France for a three-power treaty to guarantee Poland's boundaries, Soviet Russia suddenly turned about and entered into a non-aggression alliance with Nazi Germany. Although communists had once been described as the scum of the earth by the Nazi Führer, and though communism and Nazism had long been irreconcilable enemies, both nations considered the partnership mutually advantageous from a strictly military standpoint. Less than a fortnight after the signing of the Russo-German Pact, the Hitler timetable called for a quick thrust against Poland. This time, there was no mistaking the Führer's intentions. No compromise was possible. Carefully trained Nazi soldiers deposited on Polish soil in a lightning strike helped disorganize the enemy, which was ill-equipped to resist the powerful German Blitzkrieg. Behind the paratroopers came hundreds of German tanks, which plunged on through the Polish countryside against little opposition. The Polish plans for defense were virtually worthless against the might of the highly geared modern German war machine. The vaunted Nazi Wehrmacht was brutally thorough, sparing nothing in its steady advance. All the years of training and indoctrination in Nazi ideals repaid their cost to Hitler in Poland. For in each young Nazi soldier surged the will to conquer for the Führer. Yes, the Nazi leaders had planned well. In those first months of war, the world seemed to them to be theirs for the taking. On that historic September 1st in 1939, when the cancerous Nazi growth spread farther still, the people of Europe, England, and the world entered a new era.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, here is a recorded message from the Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Neville Chamberlain.
I am speaking to you in the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany. You can imagine what a bitter blow it is to me that all my long struggle to win peace has failed.
Even in the far-off Philippines, halfway around the globe, the momentous news of the declaration of war between England and Germany came as a rude shock to civilians, American military personnel, and the commanding officer of the military forces in the Philippines, and his senior military assistant, General Douglas MacArthur, and Colonel Dwight Eisenhower.
I was certain that the United States would be drawn into the whirlpool of the war. It seemed to me that we would be compelled to defend ourselves against the Axis within a year.
But most of his countrymen, in that first grim year of war in Europe, did not share Colonel Eisenhower's convictions. Millions of Americans felt that the war was not worth getting excited about. While Americans concerned themselves with less weighty worries, the Nazi conquest of Europe was proceeding on a quickening schedule. In the spring of 1940, Denmark and Norway fell, and then Hitler's forces overran the Low Countries, Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg. Behind her vaunted Maginot Line, France felt secure, in the belief that her fortress facing Germany to the east was impregnable. Imbued with a deep aversion to aggressive war, the French put their faith in defensive warfare, a defense based on French military successes in World War I. They reasoned that any aggressive move by Germany against France would obviously come from the east, across the French-German border, now rendered impassable by the intricate fortifications which were constructed a decade earlier at a cost of millions of dollars. But the Nazis had other ideas about how to invade France. Bypassing the Maginot Line, swift-moving spearheads of the modernized German war machine knifed into France from Belgium in the north, and the battle for France was joined. The conquest of France was astonishingly brief. For the Führer, this was the greatest prize he had yet captured. In a matter of days, the German army was rolling through the French countryside toward Paris. Germany's traditional enemy now lay at the feet of the gloating Nazi Superman. The conquering German army marched into Paris on June 14, 1940, a day which will be remembered forever by the French people. This was the most rewarding moment in the life of the little German house painter. With Paris conquered, his dream of ruling the capitals of the world seemed closer still to becoming a reality. Across the Atlantic, the news of the collapse of France brought the war a little closer to many Americans who had a warm spot in their hearts for that gallant nation. But to most people in the U.S., the war still seemed remote. Many preferred to ignore it.
The way I see it, Bill, we stuck our noses into Europe's mess in 1917 and we got nothing for it. I say we ought to keep hands off. Let them take care of themselves. You can count me out.
Don't give it another thought, Joe. With all that water between us and Hitler, he can't hurt us. Say, what do you think of the Tigers' chances for the pennant this year?
The Tigers won the pennant that year, and the British Army was pushed off the European continent. In one of the darkest hours of the war, the British saved the situation from becoming a major disaster. At Dunkirk, in late May, the retreating British troops were forced to abandon large amounts of weapons and other equipment in their flight to the sea. The Nazis had hoped to bottle them up and annihilate them. Driven to the extreme edge of the European continent, under steady fire by the enemy, the British suffered heavy losses. But surviving British and a scattering of French troops were met by all the ships and small craft the British Navy could muster to meet the emergency. The rescue was a notable triumph for the British Navy, which succeeded in evacuating more than 335,000 men, 80% of the total, under the nose of the German Air Force. Hitler now controlled the continent right to the sea and quickly transformed the French coastal area into a gigantic base from which to attack Britain by air. In an all-out attempt to pulverize Britain, preparatory to an invasion of the English coast, the Nazis launched a series of daily air raids on London and the surrounding area in mid-June. The schedule was soon stepped up to include day and night attacks. The British people took this steady pounding in stride with magnificent calm, but with an iron determination to bear up under the worst the Jerries could give them.
Let's go!
But all England did not merely sit and take it. The Royal Air Force, though outnumbered by the stronger Luftwaffe, gave battle day and night and took an increasingly heavy toll of Nazi planes. right from the start of the Battle of Britain, the RAF shot down 3 or 4 times as many planes as it lost. But though many Nazi planes were downed, more kept coming. Once they got through the screen of RAF fighters over the channel, it was up to the British Coast Artillery.
Angle 21, bearing 198, angle 22, bearing 194. Set 10-600. 10-600. Ah!
German plane production was at a new high, and the Luftwaffe's attacks grew in frequency and intensity. As winter approached, everyone in England, from the man in the street to Winston Churchill, realized that the fate of the world depended on the battle for Britain.
Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be freed, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age, made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of vertical silence. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
With the German seizure of Denmark and Norway, the Blitz that swept from the Rhine through France to the Bay of Biscay, and the crippled retreat of the British Army from Dunkirk, America began to grow uneasy.
In early 1940, Norway, with its strategic location and access to important natural resources, became a prized target of both the German and British navies. Both countries would fight to be the victor. By late 1939, Hitler's tank forces have overtaken Poland and are headed for France. But to keep the German war machine going, natural resources must be constantly available. One of these necessities is iron ore. Nestled along the coast of Norway are ports through which such resources can be shipped to Germany, unless the British get there first. In early 1940, Norway, up to now a neutral country, becomes a strategic location for both Germany and England. After a British destroyer attacks a German Predator ship in neutral waters and frees 300 English prisoners, Hitler realizes he must take Norway quickly. He schedules an invasion for April 9th. The German plan is to simultaneously occupy ports along a 1,000-mile stretch of Norwegian coastline. Oslo in the south, Trondheim in the middle, and Narvik in the north. It'll be the first combined land, sea, and air operation in history. In late March, Britain starts secret preparations to lay mines in neutral Norwegian waters to cut the German supply line. Also, an occupying force is made ready to invade strategic Norwegian ports. At the same time, from northern German seaports, troops begin to depart.
Our first thing was to occupy Norway because England wanted to do that. We knew that by our intelligence, because they were afraid that our submarines could come out of the German bay into the Atlantic. In 2.5 days, by very stormy weather, we drove high speed up to northern Norway, north of the polar circle, to Narvik.
The British government, even again before the Germans attacked, was putting pressure on Norway to adopt a more favorable stance towards Great Britain.
But when the British receive reports of a large German fleet moving toward Norway, the Admiralty issues an order to seek out the German ships and engage them in battle. The German ability to decode messages of British naval movements enable them to avoid their pursuers. Every effort to stop the German invasion fails. Along the fjord leading to Oslo, outdated Norwegian strongholds are easily neutralized by German naval and air bombardment. At Oslo, the main airfield is taken without resistance. By noon on April 8th, 1,500 German troops march victoriously through the streets of Norway's capital. At historic Trondheim, 2 old forts protecting the entrance to the harbor are quickly taken. German troops now have control of this city as well. In the early morning on April 9th, 2 German destroyer flotillas enter the Vestafjord approach to Narvik. 2 Norwegian ships are ordered to surrender. They are unwilling to give in. The German response comes in the form of a fierce shelling.
We occupied the harbor and released our mountaineers so that they could get any Norwegian resistance. But the Norwegian didn't really resist because they were not sure were we the English or were we the Germans. And so they were hesitant, and we had an easy way to occupy Narvik and all the military outposts in the environment. There was no bloodshed and no casualty at all.
In just one day, the Germans have accomplished all their military objectives. Whatever Norwegian resistance there is sabotaged by collaborators. Communications between units are disrupted, and all countermeasures against the invading Germans fail. Former Defense Minister Vidkun Quisling has made a secret pact with the Germans to allow them easy entry. From this time on, the name Quisling becomes synonymous with traitor. On April 11th, 2 days after the German occupation of Norway, a British invasion force belatedly sets out to sea.
The British plans are really almost entirely improvised. Units are taken from everywhere. Troops are frequently not told where they're going. Even their company and regimental commanders do not know exactly where they're going. Many ships are poorly loaded, so that the things you need most, like radios, would be at the bottom of the hold. And material you need less would be more accessible. When the British respond, they put force structures together like you glue toothpicks to make a sculpture, and with no more intrinsic strength. The ships they use are the ones that are available at the time. And the Royal Navy at this stage is very badly overstretched. When you talk about British strategy in Norway, about the only thing they could think of to do was stop the Germans wherever they were. The British, in other words, were reacting to the German initiatives, and the Germans were on the ground and able to move faster.
April 13th, 1940, a British strike force heads into the German-held Norwegian port of Narvik for the first major face-off of the war. April 13th, 1940, a powerful British task force makes its final approach to Narvik.
The English came with destroyers because they had all their forces outside prepared for that occupation of northern Norway. Most of our destroyers were in the harbor. Some of them were not. My destroyer was not there either. And the English fired blindly into the harbor, sinking 3 of our destroyers and sunk them, and they also sunk 14 merchant ships of different nationalities. We in the fjord, which were about an hour away from it, heard that gunfire in the morning. We speeded in the direction of that gunfire and fell the English in the flank. And they were surprised because they didn't expect us. Then the next day, the English came with aircraft carrier and a battleship, several cruisers, and they finished us up because the cruiser gun, they could reach us. They kept out of reach from our smaller destroyer guns. So we were sunk about a mile out of the shoreline. When the order came from the skipper to abandon ship, we jumped into the water. I swam to one of the rafts, but that was overcrowded. Was later on anyway caught by the English, taken prisoners, and I tried to reach the shore.
The British counterattack at Narvik is, in narrow tactical terms, a great success. They sink almost half of the German Navy's destroyers at the loss of only 3 of their own, but the problem is the Germans are still holding Narvik. When British troops began landing at various points of the Norwegian coast, the main impression offered to the soldiers and the junior officers was one of confusion. On the whole, the British were lacking transport, they were lacking winter clothes, they were lacking the kind of foodstuffs you need to keep going in Arctic areas and in rough country. And from the various ports, these British units are sent forward with about the only mission being find the Germans, fight them, and defeat them. The average British column had almost no ability to maneuver in Norway's mountains.
The Germans rush reinforcements into southern Norway. Meanwhile, British troops land unopposed in the central part of the country. On April 18th, a German division leaves from Oslo, heading north to join up with forces holding Trondheim.
The mountaineers were all scattered around, and they formed a defense line to prevent the English from capturing Narvik. And they did a marvelous job. We knew that we had only to do that for 2-3 days, we thought, because the German army came through all of Norway to Narvik. And it was said that they would be there in 3 days, maybe 4 days. But it took them 2 weeks because there are no roads up there. And even up there where we were, there was not the road.
While the German army is penetrating more deeply into Norway, the traitor Quisling is removed from his governmental position and replaced. The new governing council immediately declares war on Germany. There are Norwegian troops resisting the Germans, but outnumbered and outgunned, they are unable to halt the enemy advance.
Within a predictable period of time, German attack planes and light bombers would be bombing and strafing roads, and it was very difficult to get off the road. There was nowhere to run to in this mountainous coastal area. So you develop a situation in which just about everybody has a stiff neck from looking skyward and looking to the rear.
Within 5 days, Germans have joined their 2 invading armies in Oslo and Trondheim. All of central and southern Norway is now under German control. The Germans flex their military might and take British prisoners of war.
I was captured at Forberg by the Germans. From there I came to Littlehammer, and we had a supper, consisted of brown bread, gorgonzola, wine, which the Germans gave to us, cigarettes, and a hot meal each day, and getting on fairly decent. And I hope the war will soon be over and we'll all be going back home.
It's a long, long way to Tipperary.
On May 27th, an Allied force moves by sea for a direct assault on Narvik.
As the campaign progresses, the British are primarily concerned with reconquering and holding Narvik and preventing a complete German victory. As the central sector falls more and more under German control, Narvik is seen by the British and French as the key to their successful completion of the campaign.
To take Narvik from the rear is impossible because of the mountains. We don't even bother to put up a defense line from that direction. Our mountaineers always choose a higher positions, so they will be above when the enemy approaches. The whole population has left Narvik because of the British shelling the town. They all went to their ski huts in the mountains. They know we won't give up easily. Whatever the English want, they will have to get by fighting their way through.
Put together an expeditionary corps, and the main thing, they have to get our landing craft. The attack on Narvik is the first time that the British use modern landing craft, because the British understand that, and the French understand as well, that it's going to have to be an opposed landing, and you can't do this in an improvised fashion.
The Germans in the hills around Narvik are commanded by a mountain troops officer who uses the rugged terrain for cover He doesn't want to give the British Navy any targets. But the British will not continue to hold Narvik. With Allied armies retreating from the Germans in France, orders are issued for an immediate withdrawal from Norway.
Within a few days, it becomes obvious that Narvik is now a sideshow of a sideshow, and it is pointless to continue the campaign. So the French and British withdraw, and the ordinary British express themselves in words more colorful than polite. Many of his superior officers aren't very happy as well with this either.
The Luftwaffe renews its air attacks as the troops are loaded aboard ships.
Germans, well, their destroyers are all gone, and their air transports are overstretched. And the German general pulls out a large handkerchief, mops his brow, and offers thanks.
Only one Allied objective remains in Norway, the destruction of Narvik's port facilities. Over a period of 5 days, the Allied evacuation is completed. By June 8th, all 25,000 French and British troops are aboard transports and on their way to England.
British morale was at rock bottom. In some ways, the Norway morale was even worse than those who come out of Dunkirk, because the Narvik Expeditionary Force said we were pulled away from a victory, that it was ours.
Rudi Tepfer stays in Norway with the occupying force before returning to Germany and being reassigned to U-boat duty. Although the Germans can bask in the glory of their victory, it is not without losses. 2 days after the evacuation, Norway surrenders. It is a fortuitous but decisive German victory.